All right, let's get started. So we're going to talk about building some clean tech innovation ecosystems. We'll do some introductions. We'll have people give some backgrounds, some frameworks, and then we'll get into some questions among us, and then we'll open it up to questions from you guys after we get started. So to get started, my name is Todd Almendinger. I'm from the Cleantech Group. I lead the consulting and research teams. Introduce Emily, the executive director from Novarium.
Hi. You want me to introduce myself? Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. So Novarium, in a few sentences, is a campus that's fully dedicated to scaling the blue economy, or what we call ocean tech. So there was a cluster that existed for the past 2 decades with 500 researchers, 10 applied research center, a very fabulous university that's notorious for its ocean work, but it was very difficult to commercialize those solutions. So I'll be here today to share how we achieved a new era for the blue economy sector.
And introduce David, a councillor here in the city of Melbourne, part of our gracious host.
Thank you, and welcome everyone to the City of Melbourne. I'm sure there are many people who've travelled around the world to be here, also people who have travelled down the street to be here in what is a wonderful city. We always start our City of Melbourne events, and I'm sure yesterday the full event would have started with an acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the land, but I'll certainly add my voice to that this morning on behalf of the city, and to acknowledge the fact that we're meeting on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung people, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'll talk a bit more about the city's role in this sphere overall as we go along, obviously this morning, but always important to recognise the fact that we are here on the lands of people who've been here for 65,000 years, that they have knowledge and experience of many things that are important in how we're facing the challenges that we have as a city, as a nation and as a world, and that one of the roles that we have as a local government is to try and translate that knowledge into meaningful outcomes. And so we might touch on that a little bit along the way this morning as well.
All right, and then to set the stage for a little bit, clean tech is a big word, a lot of different areas it covers. And from our point of view, it covers everything from agriculture and food, materials and chemicals, energy and power, transportation, logistics, resources and environment. When we talk about things like the blue economy, that's a combination of several different parts. It has the transportation piece, it has the agriculture and food piece, it has materials. So it's an interesting intersection across some of these different areas. And from a city point of view, there's a lot of important parts of clean tech, from energy and materials, making Melbourne continue to be one of the most attractive places to live in the world. So when we look at that, we also think about it in 2 bigger terms. A lot of people are focused on mitigation, on reducing emissions. But we also have to think about in terms of adaptation and resilience. And when I ask people about how many people understand when I say 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's the goal. That's the goal. If I say 328, does that number mean anything to anybody? It's a number I learned the other day when we were at a breakfast with the city of Melbourne. One of the professors pointed out that 328 is how many weeks we have left to keep that target of 1.5 degrees from happening. It's not that much time, 328. Considering right now the global average temperature has gone up 1.1 degrees. We're almost there. So we absolutely need to keep mitigating, but we also need to talk about resilience. And by resilience, we need to think about food supply. We need to think about reusing food waste, minimizing food waste. We need to talk about how do we grow things in a hotter temperature? How do we do it with less water on land? What can we grow in the oceans that we haven't been growing before? So there's a bunch of these things that we need to think about when we talk about clean tech and what goes into the innovation ecosystem. And clean tech, like I said, is a little bit different than a lot of other ecosystems, is that it requires facilities, it requires laboratories, it requires test beds. And some of that can come from universities, but it also needs the intersection with corporates. If we step back into the bigger picture, we tend to look in a view of supply and demand. And supply is the supply of innovators. It's the supply of great ideas that get from universities, they get from entrepreneurs themselves, and to create those initial companies. And those initial companies are hugely important to the local economy. They create jobs, they create relationships, and they help that build and grow. And question is, if we're going to have a climate impact on climate, it has to go beyond just the city. It has to scale up. And that only happens if it's tied to the demand owners. And frequently, the demand owners are large corporates. Demand owners can be cities. They can be regional governments. So a city could be a demand owner and saying, all new buildings have to meet a certain standard, or we need to reduce the heat in the city, so all roads are going to be painted white. That's an example. I came across this recently, actually. There's a couple of cities that are experimenting with painting the roads with a very bright white material, and they found it can reduce the temperature in cities by up to 10 degrees Celsius. And I believe here, like around Christmas time, it can be 40 degrees, right? It's kind of hard to be jolly outside at 40 degrees Celsius. So, but when we think about this supply and demand, it's important to have both parts of it. And I think people have been building ecosystems and learning a lot how they do it. So one of the questions I'd like to ask Emily is about, can you tell us about the journey of building the ecosystem? Because it didn't happen overnight, did it?
It didn't, and I keep saying I didn't invent anything. I arrived with that mandate 2 years ago, and there was already a very dynamic cluster in place, but they were operating under the radar, and they were doing what they were good at. So the university folks are publishing and doing deep research, and the research centers, they have their R&D clients, and they run their business. And the startup ecosystem a few kilometers away are doing their own things, programming and developing AI solutions. Nobody knew each other, and nobody was talking to each other, and they were a few blocks away from each other. So basically, we built an infrastructure, the physical space. Sometimes it can become a white elephant, but if it's utilized properly, having a physical space where all of these researchers and startups can interact and kind of collide, that's very crucial. It changed the dynamic rapidly. Another thing that's also very important, it's collaboration with the city and with the regional economic development, and eventually with the governments. Nobody really knew what the blue economy was all about. Nobody really knew the opportunity that was behind the blue economy, and it's spread it out between different sectors. It's a little bit the same with Cleantech. So it's a little bit of AI, it's a little bit of marine biotech, it's a little bit of robotics, it's a little bit of underwater research, satellite imaging, AI optimization. So a lot of expertise, but very spread out. And it was very difficult to have a coherent narrative when we were trying to engage with the people who could finance our project. So we had to do an exercise of rebranding and really tie in it also to an attractivity strategy with the city, so that it becomes something that we can talk about and be proud of. We also brought in experts from Startup Genome and Cleantech Group and really looked at what was happening already in the clean tech sector. The blue economy was maybe 10 years behind, but we didn't want to reinvent everything. So we got a lot of data, and we tried to build like a solid business case. It's not just about, oh, let's slave the oceans, it's really nice, and we're going to generate impact. It's also about like the business economic development behind it. Why is it relevant? Why do we need to invest in this? And what we saw in other clusters all over the world, emerging in the blue economy sectors, in Portugal and the Scandinavian countries, they are a bit further ahead. And what we saw is that when there was a strong commitment from local authorities and government, then the investment funds were coming up, and then the ball was getting rolling. So the first step is really to get this synergy going. It took us maybe 18 months to get there, but once the ball is rolling, and once there's a strong commitment from government, then we start having people from all over the world wanting to work with us. So that's great. But keep up the very hard work at the beginning.
And I think it's important to acknowledge, you keep using the word cluster.
Yeah.
And a cluster is a very concentrated area like blue economy. The bigger ecosystem can be made up of a series of clusters. And so when we take a look at the city of Melbourne, great beer, interesting gins, magic coffees, pretty visible things we see here. But, what are the things that you see here in your city that are strengths that you can build on, that clusters could be built around?
Well, absolutely. So first of all, I think that it's what you're saying there, Emily, really resonates with where we're thinking about we are on our journey in terms of understanding that there's some locations where some really great work is going on, understanding that we've got some leading universities that are doing some really innovative things, understanding that there is a market out there that is keen to be receiving of this research. But it's drawing all of those things together and starting to get a real sort of effect occurring as we get the momentum rolling on those sorts of things that I think is the challenge for us as a city and as a local government. And probably worth explaining to people, and I'm going to interrupt myself for my old school teacher thing, which is to say, come and sit down, people, there's plenty of seats here around the table, so don't feel the need to stand up the back. It'll make me feel less nervous to have a gathering around us up the front here. But probably worth explaining to people who are newer to Australia that we have 3 tiers of government and that we obviously have the federal level, the state level, and then we, as the City of Melbourne, operate on a different scale with a different level of budget. And so that gives us both opportunities but also restrictions on our capacity to start to have the kinds of effects that we'd like to be seeing. So we have approximately a $1 billion Australian budget if you draw together all of the things that we might have within our resources. And so we need to be cognisant about what it is that we can sensibly be doing with our resources to start to build those links between the various components that we'd like to see, to start to link that supply and demand that you're describing there, and that becomes a key role in what we can meaningfully be doing with the resources and policies at our disposal.
And, talk about the strengths, Emily, you guys have this. What have you done to reach out to the global demand owners? Because that's been an important part of how you guys have built your organization.
Well, I think traditionally when we think about growing a cluster, we try to get the research out of the lab and convert it into startups. And it's an interesting journey, and everybody's trying to crack the code for that. But the maturity the maturity cycle for that approach is very long. And as you said, we don't have that much time. We need to be super proactive in the way we're doing things. So instead, we try to kind of leapfrog and try to reach out to startup ecosystems that were a bit more mature in AI and clean tech, and we thought probably solutions to problems already exist. It's just that those talents don't know the maritime sector, they don't know what our partners need, so we're going to try to work with our industrial partners like the port authorities and the shipping lines, not just from Canada, but from all over the world as well, because they all have the same issues. And we try to, so basically we're developing with them in collaboration with a few ports. We did a prototype, and then we're at the point where we're scaling it. So basically we establish very tangible solution. It's not innovation theater. It's one issue, and then we with partners from the clean tech sector, we go through our global network of accelerators, and we find solutions that are very mature, that already have been tested in other fields, but that can be customized for our industrial partners. And within 6 to 8 months, there's an industrial integration, and then we help those startups to scale. So that's a new model, and so far it's been working really great for us.
So I think that's really important part is this is demand-led innovation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you identify those challenges from the demand owners, from the ports and the corporates?
Yeah, well, the maritime transport sector is very interesting. I keep discovering it every day. It's maybe where the bank sector was 15 years ago. So sometimes they have one director of innovation, maybe a team of 2. and maybe sometimes it's not even their full-time job. So expecting them to arrive with a plan to solve all of their issues is really not realistic. And even the most competent and very proactive director of innovations are trying to understand the startup ecosystems, but they start from scratch, and it takes them 2-3 years to kind of get the gist. So we arrive with turnkey solutions. We do all of the mapping for them, and we establish a roadmap of what they want to solve. And we start. I like the theory of the little steps, because internally they also have to get the buy-in from their boards, and it's not always the key priority too. Well, it's becoming more and more a key priority, but it's not. They still need to sell the innovation component and get the budgets going. So we start small with projects that can be solved rapidly around water testing, for example, having dashboards and being able to monitor in real time. And then, there's a solution for that, and they can implement it rapidly. So they really ask us to have quick wins. Instead of doing like huge AI projects, that's what we had in mind at first with camera capture, and we're gonna get there, but we need at first to build the confidence and build the trust and show that our way of doing things and the language of the startups can actually bring a lot of value to them.
Yeah, and I think that's an important part of this demand-led, where I think the city is going to be more supply push and then finding the partners. So how do you guys communicate those strengths to everybody?
Well, I think it probably comes from both ends of the equation. It's partly the role that we can do in convening both the supply side, but also convening the demand side. And we found with some of the groups that we're convening with our Cleantech clusters, our zero carbon cluster, is that there's a huge number of people here in the city, a huge number of researchers and research organisations that have the capacities and the knowledge here, but it's about actually bringing them together. And I think, again, I resonate with what Emily's describing there about making sure that there's a mix of those early small projects that clearly deliver quickly, but also having a bit of an eye to what it means to have the right amount of funding and opportunity for people who have longer term goals. I hear the 328 weeks, and that is certainly something that is, makes us think deeply. But we know that there are sort of those medium and long-term projects, and the city has a role in those as well, in making sure that people feel confident that this city is the right place to actually be doing projects of that length and that scale, that there's support from the city, and that there's sort of an ecosystem and environment where those projects are feasible to undertake.
I think you make a hugely important point about the role of convening. And in the work we've done in ecosystems, you talk to the entrepreneurs, one of the things that they like the most, they benefit the most, is being at events. Not just to be able to talk to other innovators, but to talk to investors, to talk to demand owners. And there's different roles and responsibilities within an ecosystem. And you think of the city as one of the main, maybe it's the conductor of trying to put everything together. And convening is a huge piece to that, to bring people together.
I really feel that's the case, and then out of that convening, the advocacy role that we can have to other levels of government. So even if we don't have enormous funds ourselves in the same realm that the state government and the federal government do, if we can hear from people being an accessible level of government what it is that they need to be supported in their entrepreneurial work, and then we can take that to the state and federal level, encourage the state and federal level to set up funds that allow people to access them and do that work. Well, that's obviously good for the entrepreneurs, but it's good for the city as well, because that means that that work stays in Melbourne.
And in terms of accelerating the pace of innovation for those corporate partners, I think even small budgets that are accessible from the city or from the regional development, it's not sometimes that they need the money so much, but it's that their budget is allocated 1 to 3 years in advance, and if they want to move rapidly within 6 months for an industrial integration, they don't have a lot of how do you say that, space to make that kind of decision rapidly. So being able to offer them just a little bit of incentive that we fund part of the program, that's a great sweetener to start the conversation.
And I think one of the things in Cleantech that's important is getting the voices of innovation in front of policymakers. And a lot of the times, policymakers are saying, yeah, we want to do this. And they're hearing from large corporates that we can do that in 20 years. And if you can say, well, hang on, why does it take 20 years? Here's 5 companies doing this now. I think an interesting example is concrete and cement. Concrete's 8% of the emissions. And a lot of the times, there's innovations in concrete that reduce the amount of clinker. But regulatory-wise, they say, well, you have to have X% of clinker. So here's a great solution, but they can't get a regulation changed. So what does that do? Well, here in Melbourne, there's a great company called Calix, or in Australia, Calix. And they've got a new technology that makes the clinker and the cement with a zero emissions, using a capture technology and a new technology to do it. So these are the types of things that drive innovation. And on the one hand, getting these voices of innovation in front of policymakers is hugely important. And like you said, it's not just funding. And there's a role for government in funding, but they're not the answer. We found in looking at different ecosystems that too much granting is a problem. What happens is small companies get used to the grants. They get happy with that. They get to 10 people, 15 people, and that's where they stay. And the problem with them staying there is then investors don't want to come in. Investors don't want to invest in a company that's happy to be 10 or 20 people. They want to invest in companies that are going to grow.
Yeah, and on that note, kind of opening my mental doors for our corporate partners through this funded program is also a good way to start the conversation. Some of them are going to say, oh, we already do innovation and R&D. We have all our corporate partners, and we've been doing that for many years, and we're really good at innovation. And then you kind of showcase some of the technology that are emerging from the cleantech sector and other sectors, and it blows their mind, and it really brings them at another level. And then you can have a very interesting creative conversation because you're getting them out of their box.
Yeah, I think that's an important part to it of saying it doesn't have to be made here. And over the past couple of years, we track a lot of data, investments, and startups. There's a significant increase in corporate participation in innovators. And corporates go through this cycle of, okay, we got to do something about innovation, so we can do it ourselves. And like, well, that's kind of not working. Let's put our money in somebody else's fund, and they're going to take care of it. And that doesn't quite work. Okay, well, we know enough about it. We're going to start our own fund. Corporates start their own funds. They bring in a bunch of venture capital team. And the venture capital team is quite a bit different than corporate. Venture capitalists make their money on carried interest. That means there has to be exits. That means you have to take risks. Well, you get a venture capital team inside corporates and you got a CFO going, that's kind of risky, I don't want to do that. Or, we'll sign that contract, but these 64 pages of legalese make it really difficult to do something. Or we're going to pay you in 120 days. So being able to open that and change how you think about it's important. It's also important with the ecosystems, because I think one of the things that you're talking about is you're not just a single closed ecosystem. And it doesn't have to be invented here. So when you take maybe the city of Melbourne, maybe you have a challenge that you don't have a local innovative solution. But how do you attract innovators from somewhere else to come to Melbourne, aside from being a great place to live? They want to come because they see the opportunity to work in the ecosystem that has laboratories, that has facilities, that has corporates that they can connect to. It has other entrepreneurs that they can hire and bring into the business. So when you're building that ecosystem, you have to remember, you also have to be open to bringing innovation in from somewhere else. You guys are looking all over the place for different types of innovation.
Yeah, and at first it wasn't easy because we were talking about regional development. We were not based in a big city, but traditionally they wanted everything to stay in house, and that's where there's no dynamism, there's no innovation and no growth in a cluster if you just stay locally. You bring in a bit of capital, you bring in new talents, and all of a sudden it creates this kind of collision and this kind of tension that actually brings everybody forward. And in terms of attractivity, coming back to cities, an attraction of talents, I think that's a key aspect to look at. It's of course, it's not innovation theater, but you do need to tell the story coherently, and it has to resonate with a younger generation who wants to save the world, who wants to generate impact, who's looking for meaning, and they're tired of just coding and they want to do something else. But it needs to be enticing, and you need to showcase what kind of ecosystem and what kind of dynamism you have to offer. And I think Melbourne is a great place for attracting new talents.
I think, look, I'm glad you say Melbourne's a great place for it. I completely agree about that. And I sort of see that building on some of those things that I mentioned earlier on in terms of the convening, of the bringing people together and understanding what it is that they're desiring to do as entrepreneurs, the advocacy that we can do to other levels of government sitting above that. But then I guess that next stage on is that promotion of the city and that speaking on behalf of the city to the rest of the world about what it is that we're trying to achieve here. Hopefully will attract people, but certainly needs to be built on making sure we actually understand what it is that the ecosystem here wants us to say on their behalf. So rather than the city or politicians especially thinking that they have the right answer, it's actually about listening first of all, synthesising those messages and then speaking on their behalf. And absolutely, in terms of attracting young people, not just attracting young people, but as part of my portfolio at the city, retaining international students who are vital to the city of Melbourne in terms of the education that we have here. We have, hundreds of thousands of international students who choose Melbourne as a place to come and study, particularly at the undergraduate level. We know many of them aspire to do meaningful things with their careers going on from that, and it's about letting them know that Melbourne is a place where they can stay, not only to study postgraduate, but to start to build their own businesses, to start to do that in entrepreneurship, that innovation that they want their lives to be built around, and that this is the place to be doing it.
And usually what we see is if there's a commitment from the city or the regional development agency, then some companies, some corporate partners also decide to take the lead and tell their story of innovation, because they're also realizing that they're starting to have a recruitment issue. And if they are doing things around climate, most of the time they don't have the budget, or they don't really know how to communicate what they're doing well. So that's where also all of the global innovation challenges and the programming that we're building for them is really helping them to position themselves as future leaders that are attractive.
Yeah, and I think another important aspect of convening is enabling. And we were talking earlier today about ports. Every port around the world is different. Who owns the land? Who owns the business on it? Who can direct it? Can they have a fund? What do they do? It is different. You guys deal with lots of different ports, and your guys' port here. You may not own it, but you may enable an introduction. You may enable a conversation. You may open that for innovators to have a conversation with somebody. That often is one of the most important things of being able to do. It doesn't take funds. It takes the ability to know who the right people are and enable those conversations.
Yeah, and the ports and shipping lines, and also big companies in other sectors are a great entry door because they have the notoriety, and they have a leadership role that they don't always take, but when they decide to take it, then you can see that the whole industry follows after that. And they were telling us that in a lot of cases, the smaller players don't really want to share their issues. They want to do their business as usual, and they're trying to solve everything by themselves because, they don't want to advertise themselves as having problems. So the ports or the bigger shipping lines can take this role of identifying some issues without name shaming anybody, and so we can try to solve solutions and bring startups on a silver platter to companies who didn't really want to take a public stand.
And so, as a blue economy cluster, you've built a global ecosystem related to this cluster. And you start out saying, it was about 20 years, and then in 18 months. So if you look back and you were to say, what were the things that you've learned if you were to tell somebody else building it? What would be 3 things that you could think about to help people build an ecosystem?
Well, I think communication and democratization of science, making it easy and palatable and coherent for everybody and sexy to a certain extent, is really crucial. That's kind of the first step. You have a short pitch deck with a brand, and you're able to tell your story to the research centers, to the government, to the cities, to all of your corporate partners, so everybody knows what you're up to. Even if they don't really understand sometimes what you're trying to do, at least there's a story there. Second thing would be opening up to international talents very quickly. So what we decided to do was to build well, we started everything during COVID, which was helpful, and we're based 6 hours away from Montreal, so that was also helpful to think virtually from the get-go. So of course we have a campus physical with all of the infrastructure in our hometown, but we built collaboration right away with the Port of Quebec, with the City of Montreal, with Toronto, with Lisbon, with Barcelona, with Melbourne maybe, hopefully. So we decided to branch out and create those corridors. The universities do it really well with students. Why can't we do it with startups? Sending them right away to have a global mindset, to develop partnerships in a bigger ecosystem. Maybe the Port of Barcelona is way better than the Port of Montreal for the solution that they're developing. Maybe they're more advanced. So it's kind of like, scaling up rapidly and having a global mindset from the get-go. And maybe the third thing I'd say is really working closely with the public authorities. It takes a while. It can be frustrating when you're not so patient, but really working at the local level and at also the federal level, working with other provinces or other players, really having a coherent message from different partners. Then you get public investment, and that's what was lacking for the past 2 decades. That the government didn't really understand what we were doing, and they didn't invest. And when you don't invest, then the clusters don't live.
And so, David, looking ahead 5 years, in addition to becoming a blue economy cluster, because we know that's already going to happen now.
Yeah.
Take that as an outcome out of today already, so that's good.
So in about 5 years, what are some things you'd like to see in the city as far as a clean tech ecosystem?
Well, I think that, in addition to the kinds of things we've been discussing already, one of the things that's most exciting for us is the fact that, like many older cities, in terms of Australia at least, we have whole suburbs now that we're going to be doing new things with. So, for instance, Fisherman's Bend, which is out very close to the port area, and also the Arden Macaulay area, which is a sort of an inner city infill site. The former dock areas, these are the areas where there used to be car factories and component factories that now have a whole capacity to become new innovation districts for the City of Melbourne. And I think getting our policy settings right in those areas is going to be vitally important, working with our partners like the universities, being very open to ideas wherever they come from, as you say, whether they're homegrown, which is fantastic, whether they're from overseas and wanting to come here, and making those spaces the best they can be. So Fisherman's Bend would be a classic example. I highly encourage people who aren't from Melbourne to have a bit of a look at what we're doing in those spaces. I'd love to see that becoming an area which is flourishing, full of people, not full of old empty sheds as it is at the moment, and really doing cutting edge things in the kinds of spaces that we're talking about. So in terms of the blue tech, well, literally you can see the docks over the other side from that. We'll have the University of Melbourne Engineering Department there, for instance, things like that. So bringing all of those things together in a physical space and having spaces for the new technologies like that alongside some of those areas that we already do, for instance, like the Parkville biotech area, where we already have other areas which are sort of leading edge in the world.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. I want to open it up to questions, conversation, discussion. It's been really interesting conversation of a cluster that's been built into a global ecosystem and a city that is acting as a convener and enabler, trying to build on the strengths that you have to an even better clean tech innovation ecosystem. So we'll open up to you guys. Some questions.
How can we help?
Examples that you may have from your own experience. What are things that you've seen have worked or things that you wish you had? questions you could ask of these guys. A pitch from Cleantech Group back there, the Cleantech
We have someone
Victoria.
here.
Sorry, please.
Hey, I'm from the University of Newcastle. I'm not sure if it's there.
Which Newcastle? Sorry.
University, sorry.
I said which Newcastle?
Which country?
Okay.
New South Wales. We typically run industry agnostic accelerators, pre-accelerators, deep accelerators, and incubators. We're embarking next year on a clean tech focused accelerator. There are some mistakes that we can probably make, but we've tried to avoid them. Does anyone on the panel have any advice on things that we need to focus on early for clean tech based startups, many of which will be coming from research commercialized technology?
That's a great question. The question is, yeah, you can use your mic.
So the question is, how can we who typically run... Okay. My name is Richard, I'm from the University of Newcastle. We typically run industry agnostic accelerators. Next year we'll be running a clean tech based accelerator. What mistakes can we avoid or what wins can we get early? And what do we need to focus on? A theme I hear about is corporate partners. We have a port in Newcastle. They're one of our strategic partners within our Entrepreneurship Centre. How do we avoid these mistakes for a clean tech based cohort?
First, I'd like to say that there are so many great accelerators and incubators that are general, that are treating all sectors. And for us, it was, we really wanted to be mindful of not competing with the ecosystem that was emerging in Montreal and in the province of Quebec. So we decided, and to be honest, it's a skill in itself to grow, to lead cohorts and to grow, especially at the low maturity level. It's very labor intensive, and some people are doing great work in that field. So we decided that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel, we would just work with them. So we decided to do joint acceleration and incubation programming, depending on the field. So if we have a startup that's more in biotech, then we send them to a partner that has a bit more expertise in that field. Or if they're very early stage, we'll send them to an incubator that's super general, and so they need to mature a bit further. But what we do is we have entrepreneurs in residence who are used to scale companies, and we have a few mentors that know the industry that we're in really, really well. So instead of waiting for them to achieve a certain TRL level to start connecting them to port authorities or shipping lines, we try to intervene at the very beginning. So they run they do the general programming, they do the cohorts, they learn how to build a pitch and to do all of the basics, but they also have touch points regularly with us. We finance part of the cost if there's a cost associated to it, and we wait until they're a bit more mature. When they're ready to raise money, that's where our team can really bring a lot of value, because we know the landscape and we know how to open these doors for them, and we almost become rep, trying to connect them to industrial partners. But clean tech specifically, maybe you're probably the expert.
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One, what are the strengths of the university? So when you look at the clean tech areas, do you have particular expertise in materials, in agriculture? So what are these strengths that you already have? So start with those strengths and then reach out to corporates and see what are their pain points. What do they need? And some of it may be immediate needs, some of it may be longer term. So trying to connect those two. With that in mind, you can't just do it once. You can't say, well, we're going to try it. You're going to try it and fail, just like all the other ones. You have to accept that you're going to get things wrong, but this isn't a one-year program, it's a 5-year program. And so you're going to address near-term needs and longer-term needs, and you're going to learn how to do it. Another key piece thinking about that is, what else do you have that's going to be different? Do you have facilities? So do you have laboratories, prototypes, labs? And an important part in clean tech, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is it's a little bit different than software as far as building software and then scaling it up. You can build a widget, you can prototype the widget and make sure it works, but you need that industrial expertise to make 1,000 widgets. And you've got a great idea, but how do you get to 1,000? That involves supply chains. It involves a whole bunch of other expertise that you may not have in the accelerator, you may not have within that team. But this is where the corporates, the demand owners, they can build that in from the very beginning. You say, well, I need a blue widget. Well, no, actually, you need an indigo widget because this is what's going to be available in the supply chain and how you make it happen. So as you're designing it, get them involved in the design, understand their points, and then they can be sponsors. You know, you can do a cohort that is around a specific topic that may have 2 or 3 things. I think in the corporate, you may also want to bring in a law firm that can be there to help to advise some of this. You may want to bring in a venture capital advisor. You may want to bring in another fund. I don't know how you do your other programs, but thinking about some of these key pieces, and it's going to be have the facilities, engage the corporate, and build on your strengths.
Ranging from Core Innovation Hub, so we from WA representing Beth, it's great to be in Melbourne. Thanks for that awesome session. So Core Hub is in the business of building ecosystems and innovation infrastructure specifically for the mining, resources, and energy sectors. So as you can imagine, Cleantech, Green-tech, and all of this is very much front of mind and a big focus for us. I guess I was just sort of hearing a few of the things that you're all talking about in terms of the supply of innovators and engaging more broadly in terms of attracting people. I think for me, over the last couple of days, what I've started to understand is, climate change, these massive global challenges. I guess it's not a City of Melbourne problem, it's not a City of Perth problem, it's not a City of New South Wales problem. So, from all of your expertise, where do you sort of see the role of, even just nationally, how we collaborate a bit more effectively, and what are some of the tangible things that we can do? I mean, in WA, I know before the end of this year, we're sort of looking at sort of really building out these clusters. So I'd be keen to sort of understand, get your thoughts on how you see everyone kind of, working together.
Well, I think maybe you need to relocate to Margaret River, and you get a lot of people come into the vineyards, and that'd be a great thing. No, just teasing.
I'm seeing a theme in how you, which particular drinks you associate with which particular parts of Australia, so it's good to hear that Melbourne's on the beer and gin front. The part of what you're mapping out there, I think, is a part of the challenge that we face at the City of Melbourne in terms of where our ecosystems are at and where we're at because of the federal political spheres that we've moved through over the time. So we're probably behind where we would ideally like to be. The advantage for us in that is that there's a lot of opportunity for growth and rapid growth. But as we see the opportunities that come through as a more federal government, starts to take the issues that we're talking about this morning more seriously, hopefully there's going to be more capacity for the kinds of funds that we really need to provide that economic grunt in terms of the grants and so forth. And again, so for the City of Melbourne, it's about making sure that our entrepreneurs and our startups understand the routes to actually get those funds because I think you're right in saying that when we hear the timeframes, when we see the scale of the problem we're trying to tackle, it definitely needs to be more than just a single city or a single state tackling those kinds of problems. It's something that the whole globe needs to tackle, and for that reason, making sure that we're doing the best things that we can do with our brains here becomes even more vital.
Maybe a Canadian perspective. We're a big country, well, like you, but we don't have that many big populations. So I think collaboration and going beyond the traditional model of funding. Of course, all of the states have their regional funding, and our mandate is usually to generate economic development in our state, and of course that's our main priority. But rapidly we try to branch out and go to other states and do partnerships with other incubators or accelerators, try to join forces, do international missions together. And now we just saw the Canadian Ocean Supercluster announced a joint venture with UKTI in the UK to fund company 50-50. So I think we all can be creative in the way we can tackle this because climate change is everywhere and we all have the same issues.
And I think one of the interesting things about blue economy is it's not a place-based challenge. It's a global challenge that happens to have been organized in one place and then has built that network. So the question always back to you is, what are those strengths? What are those challenges that you want to address? And one way is, what are local challenges as a starting point? maybe it's housing. You also are on the ocean. What are those challenges locally that you can start addressing, and then how can those link to other demand for that type of solution? And it may, again, be bringing in innovation to help solve your local problems. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to solve it yourself, but you may be able to enable that ecosystem by bringing other people's in.
There was a lady over there.
Thank you so much for time. Your great discussion. My name is Mariam, and I'm from Melbourne. We are from a startup called GEC Group, and we are in a very, very early stage startup. We do R&D, and we are from Cleantech environment. Our business idea is about developing a hot heating system, better to say, generally, for building and commercial buildings or housing, whatever. But the challenge that we already have and we couldn't find the solution yet is collaborating with research centers to find some right location for doing testing and prototyping. And funding is the biggest problem that I believe that everyone here in this venture have tackled with. And so at this stage, having collaboration with research centers without having financial background is the biggest challenge that we have. And I would like to make sure that Melbourne, how Melbourne is happy to work with us.
I might start that one. And first of all, it's fantastic to hear that you're here and that you're doing that work, and let's make sure we have a chat afterwards about more specific things. But to perhaps bring together the work that you were doing, but also what Todd was talking about earlier on about solving the kind of problems that we as a city have and using the expertise that we have. One of the things that we were debating at council last night was the retrofitting of existing buildings in the city and using that as a way of ensuring that we are reducing our carbon footprint as rapidly as possible. And when I think about both cooling of buildings, which obviously is an issue as we're looking forward to summer, but also heating of buildings in winter, how we can do that efficiently, what the new technologies are, how that can be something that is important both to the City of Melbourne in terms of our broader SDG goals, but also in developing industries here. There are just so many natural fits, and I think hopefully sort of fits with the message that you've been hearing about bringing together both supply and demand, the role of local government in that, and the scale that we operate on, which might initially be just funding for a couple of buildings in one area or assisting particular landlords to address particular issues, but helping you and businesses like you get beyond those very, very initial stages into something that's more meaningful and that allows you to scale up beyond what a city can assist you with, but you've got the ball rolling already.
So I think a key part of what you've done is you've just expressed an unmet need. And you've expressed it to people that can help convene. They may not go and build you the facility, but they may enable that through other partnerships. They may enable a test bed in a building. So it's incumbent on the ecosystem to hear the voices of unmet needs. So on the city to hear this is something that's needed. Is it the city that's going to do it? Is it a university that's going to do it? Is it a corporate that's going to do it? Don't know, but the most important part is you've identified that as a need to people that can help make that happen.
And maybe one last thing in terms of there is a community, a global community that exists virtually that has the same issues as you have, and I would really encourage you to. I'm going to try to think about a few links that I can share. But there are hackathons and virtual incubation programs that would bring you. Sometimes it's free, and it can bring you to a certain stage. It can connect you with prototyping partners who maybe are not in your city but are someplace else. So that could also feed your project.
Thank you.
So there's a couple of people from the city over there I'm going to point you at too, being able to communicate to them some of those needs. And I think that's back to convening, that this is what we're trying to do. So I want to be respectful of the next group because we came in a little bit late. We're right at time right now. If you've got some more questions, we can move outside so the next group can come in and carry on the conversation.